second century we're trying to figure out where we go from here. And the gentlemen here on the panel this morning represent corporations that have been strong supporters of the association. Each one of them serves on our corporate advisory board and in other leadership positions within the association. And I think one of the things that I've observed over the years is that we sometimes have a bifurcation of our folks that are involved. And one of the reasons that the corporate advisory board exists is to provide that sort of industry, large company level perspective into what AAPG does. Because when you strip it all away, the corporations that are on the corporate advisory board are the principal reason AAPG exists from a financial standpoint. And so they're also a very strong, make up a large percentage of our membership. It's roughly about 50-50 now between corporate folks and the independent consulting community, and that is shifting as demographics shift in the industry. But what we want to do today is give you a chance to hear from them, to hear some perspectives. I've got a few questions, as Charles mentioned. Please, if you have some questions that are stimulated during this conversation, I actually always admired Phil Donahue, and so I'm going to run around and do it. Who remembers who Phil Donahue is? Okay, all right, well, let me do some quick introductions. I'll start with, I've actually lined you up in the number of years that I've known you. Sorry, Bobby. So Bobby Ryan is the Vice President of Exploration for Chevron Upstream, and you've been in that role since 2002. Three, okay.
But who's counting?
Well, that's when you're having fun. And Bobby has been chairman of the Corporate Advisory Board, continues to serve, and Chevron has been very strong supporters. All of the student programs, IBA and other programs, Chevron has historically been very, very supportive. And those are decisions that are made not just for AAPG, but SEG, SPE, the other societies at the board level. So Chevron has a strong commitment to the professional societies. Bill Maloney is currently a director at Trident Energy, and he's also a senior energy advisor at Warburg Pincus. Before that, Bill headed Statoil's North American operations, and before that he was head of global exploration for Statoil. And before that there were other things too. Bob is vice president of upstream for IHS Markit. You heard from Bob today. I actually first met Bob when he was country manager for, exploration manager for Libya, in Libya for Conoco. And so after the sanctions were lifted, Bob parachuted into North Africa and spent a couple of years there. And then Chandler Wilhelm. Chandler, as you know, is vice president at Shell. He's also a past president of the Division of Professional Affairs, actually immediate past president of DPA. So Chandler, thank you for your service there. So I've got a couple of questions, and we're really, this is going to be an informal conversation. These are some of the kinds of questions that the Corporate Advisory Board is routinely asking itself. And let's start, earlier this morning, Bob presented sort of a high-level view of exploration. You guys all have exploration backgrounds. I would say that not all of the statistics Bob cited were actually very inspiring and encouraging. And so from your perspectives in the industry, where do you see exploration heading? And what are the skill sets that are going to be needed to be successful in that environment? And Bobby, why don't we start with you?
Okay, I get to start? So how's that? Can you hear me? Well, a company Chevron's size, it covers most of the dots on Bob's map. But if I looked at two families of activity, one was basically deep water and one's unconventionals. Lots of asset classes we look at, heavy oil, LNG, the way we break things down. Some of it's how the product moves, some of it's how it exists in the earth. But if you look at purely explorationists, it's, for us, the focus is deep water, unconventionals. And so a geoscientist comes into the company, the path can move in one or the other and bounce back and forth in between. So you're going to bring probably a broader skill set. You may end up part of your career focusing on one or the other, but you need to be broad enough to work in both. I don't see the the pace has slowed down, Bob, a good bit. Bob had some data that supported all that. We all know it. Our exploration budget since, 2014 was your peak year. It's down over 60%.
Yeah.
But we haven't quit exploring. We haven't lost one lease. We didn't have to give up any prospects. We just kind of throttled back the drill bit. And at the moment, we're picking up new leases, maturing the ones we had. So the key is, when you say what's the path forward from kind of an exploration point of view, the short-term piece is there. That's the feeding the unconventionals. For us, that's North America, mostly Permian and Vaca Muerta, all the things that my colleagues touched on. And then the deep water, still lease sales, still drilling wells. We've got 3 rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, deep water rigs. So the pace is slower, the effort's not, if that makes sense. And because conventional discoveries come in big lumps. The minute you stop for a 5-year window, for some reason, 10 years from now, our management's saying where were the big discoveries. And then the pace can't stop in the unconventionals, because the exploration teams need to stay out just ahead of the development teams, or you start drilling pretty inefficient development programs. So that's kind of
Yeah.
our view of the
Okay.
path forward.
Bill, do you have?
Standpoint from where Bobby is. We use 96 million barrels of oil a day, right? We produce that much and we consume that much. The world is just about in balance at the moment. However, we replace less than 25% of that. If you look, now just don't look at the exploration side, look at things that are FID, final investment decision on a development anywhere in the world, 25% or less is being replaced. So what's going on? Here in the US, production is 9.6 million barrels a day, so 10% of the global. And onshore, including Alaska, is about 8% of global production. And everyone's focused on the onshore at the moment, but it is 8% of global production. So what the heck is going to happen here? We have to explore more, and we have to add more resources. There's just no two ways about it. Companies at the moment are being driven largely by the financial market and by low prices. The financial market is demanding that you provide a decent rate of return on their investment, right? Investors want it, institutional investors want it, it's going to happen, right? Most companies are publicly traded. So at some point, you're not going to be able to keep the fields up and going, as Bob talked about earlier, and you're going to need to find more oil and gas and replace what we produce. If you look out towards 2040 and you use the EIAs or the IEAs or whoever you want to use, ExxonMobil's projections, that today we use 80% hydrocarbons for energy. In 2040, the projection is 60% hydrocarbons for energy, 40% renewables. And you can argue how we're going to get there. That on a rising tide, the world population will grow, energy usage will grow. So energy usage will grow anywhere between 25 and 35% between now and 2040. So you got 60% of a rising tide that's going to be dominantly oil and gas. And where's it going to come from? It's got to come from the explorers. We're just simply not finding enough oil and gas. And there aren't enough new developments coming on stream. Even with the rising tide of more stuff in unconventionals in the United States, with fields getting better, still not enough. 96 million barrels a day and growing. Consumption grew in the world 1.5 million barrels of oil a day in 2017. It grew 1.5 million barrels a day last year, and it's projected to grow 1.4 million barrels a day next year. Where's it all going to come from? It's got to come from exploration and then development. And so the cycle will happen again. I am absolutely positive about this. Now, you're going to shoot me 2 years from now and say, Billy, you're full of shit. That's fine. But
I'm ready to sign that.
yeah, there you go. But the cycles do happen. And the underinvestment has been absolutely massive. And until we turn that around, we're going to be in trouble from an energy usage for the planet. So I'm fairly optimistic on exploration.
All right.
I think maybe a little different approach. I think that, this is, as I mentioned, a kind of a pivotal point. And what I see most companies wrestling with now is the path forward. What is really going to be the DNA? If you're not good at exploration, you made the top 10 body. What are you going to do, right? Because there really is this question of the board of directors and investors, which really are driving that, of what is the value? And because we are in this very,
Speak up, Bob.
sorry, if we're in this very short-term kind of gratification where we go kind of quarter to quarter, right? Exploration is a long-term business, so how do we manage to play both ends of the corner? And that's really changing then the thinking that a lot of shops have. There's no doubt that there's new basins, that there's new places to go. The question is, as we go forward, and we think about your equation, maybe have a slightly different, if we think about this period of replacement of oil, not completely, but as in the transportation business, which is 50% of consumption. There's a lot more competition then to fill those spots. And therefore, it's all about then who's the low-cost producer. Every one of you, I'm sure that's the buzzword in your shops right now. What barrels are my lowest cost? That's my thing. But it's really then the thought about the optionality of the future that we all manage. We're really option managers, right? And so if the option right now is we got to show quarter by quarter, that takes everybody to these low cycle barrels. But I don't think they're there forever. I think that we do need to think of other ways to reset new ventures. Deep water has come down. It's not at bottom yet. It's getting close. Probably another year. But if you look at the deep water, there's another problem with that, which is there's 7 companies in the world that control deep water. They're the best at deep water. 3 of them are up here with me. But those are the deep water guys. So there's a lot of conflicting things that we've got to work through. Just like Henry said, a lot of it is probably, the answer's probably in front of us somewhere. We just haven't put the right 2 things together or 3 things together. So we'll get into the capabilities in a minute, but I think that's what we need to work through this reset. And the companies really need to ask themselves, what are we good at? What aren't we good at? And if it's not exploration, per se, it's at least being the explorers as we define them. There's nothing wrong with being somebody that comes in and mops up afterward, right? After it's been de-risked. But you may pay a little more, but that may be the best option for some. And when you look at a number of companies, it's another interesting thing I'll end you with this one. If you look at operated versus non-operated for a lot of companies, they're better at picking things that are to get into that they don't operate than things that they operate from an exploration standpoint.
I agree with what's been said. I'll put a slightly different nuance on that. My company sees the future like a lot of other companies and institutions see the future, and that is more diverse energy supplies, more gas-weighted energy mix, a lower carbon future for our planet and our industry as a whole, and a future in which we have to continue to attract capital based on fundamental attractiveness of our investments, which I think if we embrace that challenge, I think we will rise to that challenge as an industry. For my company, I work in shales, part of our business. We don't separate exploration and development. We have teams that manage the full life cycle from inception all the way to mature development. Those geoscientists need to be multi-skilled, need to be able to see and have skills to do the whole thing. And I think they relish that challenge, and it deepens their understanding of not only how you find barrels, but actually how you make money in this business. I think as a person who's charged with bringing investment opportunities to my senior leadership, have to compete against the opportunity to purchase mature fields for reserve growth, the way Bob talked about. I have to compete against opportunities in the chemicals business, which is a growing part of our segment, and has to compete on their intrinsic economic merit. As I say, I think if we relish that challenge and embrace it, we will sharpen our skills and become much better at delivering the kind of returns that our shareholders really require. For geoscientists, I think it means understanding the investment through the life cycle, how to not just find oil and gas, sometimes it means how we find the market for that as well. So I think there's lots of opportunity for our population of geoscientists if they embrace the challenge of delivering commercially viable projects.
Thank you. Bill?
Yeah, can I make one more comment? Taking this even up a notch from exploration, yes, we're going through a commodity cycle, but you can argue that there are structural changes happening within the energy industry right now, and I'll give you 4 examples. One is a changing of the guard. The person that's about to head his company, the person that's heading his company, the person that's heading the former company that I used to work for, the guy who's running ExxonMobil, and the guy who's running Total. Their common denominator is that they all have significant downstream experience. Downstream people in their DNA are cost cutters. They worry about improving business constantly and relentlessly, and that kind of thinking is going to permeate through all aspects of all businesses in the energy industry, upstream, downstream, new energy or renewables. Second is cost deflation. Costs have come way, way down as a result of the price of oil coming down. But in addition to that, people have gotten smarter and better at how they do things. So that while prices start to firm, costs will go up a bit, but in my view, they will not come back to where they were. Some argue 50%, some even more, that they won't exceed where they were before. That gives opportunity, especially in places like deep water. Third is climate, which Chandler mentioned briefly. We are on a path, on a long wavelength path to a low carbon society. To me, there's absolutely no doubt about that. And that has implications on what kind of energy we use, how we use it, and what we go for, be it more natural gas over oil. And then lastly, I mentioned in my first remarks, the financial markets. They are absolutely demanding a return on investment. Right? Some folks in this downturn have even sacrilege and cut their dividend, for crying out loud, right? Which is how we get paid if you're a shareholder. That they demand it, and as a result of that demand, companies will get in line. And then, especially with downstream individuals at the top, there'll be such a laser focus on returns that the focus will be more on return rather than on growth. Okay, thanks.
But just maybe one thing to amplify, Bill. So you mentioned cost, but there's an interesting question of where did that cost go, right? Who picked that up? And when you look at it, you can break cost down into structural changes and cyclical changes, right? So the group that took all the hit, that 60%, was what? Service companies. So there's a big question there, is if our business is going to continue to be alive, how much longer can these service companies, some of who, like the seismic industry, which many of us rely on, is pretty much decimated, right? So there's another bit of a quandary that we have to work through.
Let me just add a perspective to that. My company did some work looking at the competitiveness and the cost of supply of goods and services of the upstream industry versus manufacturing as a whole over the last 15 years, really since the start of this century. And the upstream industry uniquely stands out as being inefficient over that time period. And other industries have not been able to pass on those inefficiencies to the consumer the way that the upstream industry did for so many years because of OPEC being able to control the supply to the market. We are looking at how do we get equivalently competitive in terms of efficiency of delivering the cost of supply to our consumers, the way that the rest of global manufacturing is done. It doesn't matter whether it's electronics or heavy industry. Upstream was consistently a laggard during this period of time. I think we're going to get back to where we need to be.
Thanks, gentlemen. Bill, both you and Chandler mentioned the demographic changes, and you were talking about at in the C-suite and the shift to downstream. I think the other thing we're seeing within AAPG is, the quote-unquote crew change, which has been talked about for, a decade and a half, 2 decades now. But actually, as I look at some of the titles of people younger than me and the titles they have in your companies, the crew change has happened to a large extent. And so one of the questions I have is how do we, or how are your companies looking to transfer skill sets if we're in a world where we're dialing down, not eliminating exploration, but dialing it down? We're going to need those skills in the future in the deep water. How are your companies addressing that problem in terms of actually training the next generation of geoscientists, which is a smaller demographic than the boomer generation, to actually succeed in that? Or do you see a looming challenge on the horizon?
I mean, it's a challenge, but we've been talking about it for a decade, right? So the great crew change is an old term and well planned for. I mean, we've gotten smaller, our staff sizes are smaller, but we haven't stopped hiring. We still have internship programs. The numbers are all smaller, but they probably coincide with the path forward as well. We're about 50,000 employees worldwide. That's upstream, downstream, all streams, let's say. About 500 on any given day, depending on who's doing what, touch exploration.
Okay.
So you've got less than, 1% of the company looking at the next 10, 15, 20 years ahead. We still hire in that family. We still hire PEs. We still hire all the earth scientists, piece like that. The key is we've started to lose these past few years, kind of that crew change, was how did we make sure those folks are available and have been available to pass on that knowledge. Some of them come back. We have programs where they retire and then they come back, and guess what? They got rid of all the corporate mess, right? They're coming back. They get to focus 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day on mentoring, on helping the people with projects. It's worked quite well. And so it's not just purely a generalist. Sometimes it's targeted SMEs, but in other times it's that person that had the outstanding reputation for mentoring. Now that's a small example, but it's the way a company our size, and I'm sure my colleagues as well, we're preparing for this for years. So this program's been set up for a good while, because it is an issue.
Yeah.
And what you don't want, the toughest loss to me is not necessarily that 35-year person we all knew we were going to lose in a few years anyway through retirement. It's that person that's at 20 and 25 years. That's a harder loss because they've got a decade ahead of them to teach, to learn, and then to develop the widgets and gadgets of our business. If we lose that group due to energy shrinking or loss of interest and they move on to another industry or another field, that's probably a bigger hit than losing the earliest career or the later career, in my view. And that's an area of focus as well.
Thanks, Bob. So since I don't work for Statoil anymore, I retired. So let me take this from a private equity.
Yes, please.
Since I do that a lot of that these days. We're trying to create new companies. And I'll give you two examples. In the last year, Warburg, I think, has created 2 companies. One called Rimrock, which is based out of Denver, and the other one, which is called Trident, which is based out of London. These companies didn't exist a year ago. Now, the way we got them is we put management teams together. There was a nucleus of a CEO or CFO or something like that, and then grew around them, stealing from different companies. So I guess that's kind of what you do. And then the Trident model is to look for midlife assets around the world, buy them, and then do better than the operator did, change the shape of the decline curve, and make a bunch of money in the process. Well, the Trident just bought all Hess's equatorial Guinea assets for $650 million. Right, this just happened a couple of weeks ago. And Trident went from a 10-person company. Right now, there are 65 people in that company, and it's going to grow. And so it's a very different model than what the big companies talk about. We're trying to build a company, create wealth for the individuals as well as for Warburg, and then boom, it slips again. Rimrock started in Calgary. A guy named Jim Frazier is the CEO there. Started with 6 people. About a month ago, we bought a piece of Whiting's assets in the Williston Basin for $500 million. And right now, they're going through a frenzy of trying to bring more and more people into that company. So it's a different model from the big companies. We're trying to create from the start, build wealth, and then allow people to then jettison off from there. Very different model from
Yeah.
the big companies.
Yeah. Any other thoughts, Kelly?
Slightly different model, I guess two things. One is at IHS, I don't think we have a retirement age. So we have an 82-year-old geoscientist. Some of you know well. The other thing, though, is that, and you probably don't know, is we have over 400 geoscientists in our shop. We still don't feel the same pain as all of you, in that we have to do more with less. And so we're trying to move as many of them forward on the analytical tool side of business. So whether it's Tableau or Spotfire or PS1, we're trying to make sure that everyone in the geoscience business can really utilize that to do everything on a day-to-day basis. So we're basically trying to make them more productive through analytical tools, but also to eliminate then other things. So really go through that list of what should we stop doing that's not productive. So that's the kind of way that we're dealing with the future that's a little different than our colleagues here.
I'm going to speak from the perspective of a large company, much like Bobby did. Overall, our headcount has shrunk, as shown, with the downturn over the last several years, and geoscience was part of that. However, through that period, we have continued to recruit and bring in new professionals, and we continue to have internship programs and training. We recognize, at least in my part of the business, that 50% of our workforce is less than 5 years experience with the company. And we set up several years ago a dedicated coaching program. So we had some of our experienced people who we, because of their unique interest and skills and effectiveness at coaching individuals and being mentors, it's a great value proposition to them. Their job is to coach and to mentor, and that's proven to be effective. It's not just geosciences specifically; it's across all disciplines. So that's one tool we use. I think the other one is the aim to enable breadth, technical breadth through dedicated assignments across the spectrum of opportunities. I actually personally had that opportunity when I spent 2 years in corporate finance, and it just completely changed my ability to be effective as a professional. And we try to purposely do that with some of our young professionals at key stages in their career. And then to kind of build on what Bob said, we see a critical enabler for future geoscientists and future professionals as digital literacy. And the ability to be effective at working with large data sets and providing the tools and the training to be able to be as effective as possible with that.
No, thank you for that, Chandler, and that